How are you guys doing? Everybody got some coffee? Good morning, everybody. So my name is Johan Christenson. I'm the CEO of City Network. We are a public cloud provider, and we focus on regulatory sensitive companies. That means that we do a few different things than just straight up public cloud. We offer a compliant cloud, and we also do private clouds, all in different levels of what kind of regulatory compliance that our customers need. We're heavily engaged in OpenStack and other open source projects, and over time we've learned quite a bit of what it means to actually engage in a community into open source as it stands. With me here on stage, I got Christopher Price from Ericsson. Chris.
Thanks, Johan. Just to add, Johan is an elected board member of the OpenStack Foundation, which means that the foundation and the community also appreciate what City is doing in the community. But I'm Christopher Price. I work at a company called Ericsson Software Technology. That's a subsidiary of Ericsson. And our mission is essentially to bring open source to Ericsson and bring Ericsson to open source. And we have a pure open source focused mission statement, as it were. And we work with OpenStack and other communities, essentially collaborating and working with communities.
Yeah. And I wanted to start by telling you guys a little bit of a story. Actually, a story of myself in the sense of going from literally zero knowledge about open source to, let's say, more than zero knowledge of open source. So I'm going to take you back to about year 2000. It was the perfect timing for creating new companies. We just had a bubble that burst, and I don't know if you guys remember, but it was just the end of the era of blinking GIFs and so forth, and we could even change the background on the web browser. At that time, me and a couple of friends started a game called Manager Zone. It was a simple game, a management game in football, soccer, which means that when you signed up, you got a team of 11 players that you actually played against other people around the world. You normally got a team that was pretty poor, Division 6, 7, very low, which means that you had to train these guys, you had to buy players, you had to do things to make sure that your team became better. You played clubs and you played in leagues. This game became very popular, so it grew tremendously. So fast forward to 2005, we literally had millions of players. Actually, at one time I remember that we signed up about 100 new users per minute. And when you sign up 100 users per minute, that's 6,000 new users in an hour. And if you continue that track, it becomes a lot of users. It means that, you know, the infrastructure is under tremendous pressure, the software under tremendous pressure as well, as you continue to try to scale something like that and do so on a global basis. In 2005, we decided to play our own World Cup. I'm going to show you a little video here shortly. That meant that all the players in a country got to choose their national coach. That coach, in turn, got to choose the best players in that nation and play the World Cup. And just to give you a little bit of a sense here, we decided, as the World Cup started to play, we decided that, you know what, we're going to, wherever the final ends up, we're going to make an event down there, or an event there. And it ended up being Argentina and Canada in the final. So we said, let's go to Buenos Aires and make a big event down there. So we rented a place called Loco Pro Football. I know there's some Argentinians here, so I know for a fact that there's some people that know this place. It's a large place, about 500 people can get in there. And I'm going to play a little bit of a video here, hopefully that works, that just shows what that event looked like. Maybe another click. Now that is the engagement of a country that loves football, right? This is a virtual game. As a matter of fact, I remember as we approached the 80th minute, it was 1-1, and I remember saying to myself, you know what, I wonder what they do in these types of countries if the team does not win. So I even remember looking and said, where's the exit if I actually need to run in case they're going to do something to the founder of this game if Argentina didn't win. Luckily enough for me, very late in the game, Argentina scores and it's 2-1. Mohammed from Canada, it's probably the only time Canada will ever be in a World Cup final of anything, Mohammed. Exactly, we'll play some hockey later. So the deal about this story is this. After this event, we got a lot of publicity. This was all over actually South America in a big way, and Argentina went out, we're the World Cup champions, virtual. A lot of enterprise, or a few enterprises, I should say, came to us and said, you know, how did you do that? How do you scale that thing like that? How do you scale a database globally like that to make that happen? And I sat there and wondered, like, yeah, how did we do that? Now, it wasn't without problems, as you guys know. When you scale something, you know, you're going to have some issues, right? But I said 2 words. I said, you know what? Open source. That's how we solve that. And at the time, in all honesty, I did not know much about open source. I was like everybody else. You know, everybody used Linux, right? Everybody used MySQL. Everybody used some PHP or something like that. And we did too. But I never thought anything more about it. It was open source. And these guys scratched their head and said, okay, for the next question, what kind of values do you see out of open source? And I felt like Homer here. What kind of values do I see out of open source? And I started thinking, I really only see 2 things. You know what? We proved that it worked, right? Because we built this humongous game. And you know what? It's free. So those were 2 values that I saw in open source back then. And that's it, to be honest with you. And the thing was, what I noticed with these enterprises, that's what they saw as well. Yeah, it's free software, right? With certain issues and certain possibilities. And I can even take that down to today, that if you do not engage in communities and open source and don't see some of these other aspects of what open source is, you will actually probably still see that those are 2 values that anybody can see, but there's so much more to it. So an interesting conversation that this brought about to start thinking for the very first time about what is open source, you know, free software that you download and you use, right? So another thing, so fast forward to 2012. At this point, running City Network, we had launched City Cloud in 2009, and we did so with proprietary software. We realized quite quickly that this is not holding up. You got Microsoft, you got Amazon, you got Google, everybody's like growing like this, feature set and whatever. So yet again, for the second time in a big way, I sat down and said, okay, what can potentially help us solve this? Because the proprietary way is not going to work for us. So we sat down and said, listen, let's go back to open source and see what those communities are doing. So we actually ended up doing a very, very solid evaluation of 3 different projects. One was OpenStack, one was CloudStack, and one was Eucalyptus. And for those people who are as old as I am, between CloudStack and OpenStack, you can kind of compare it to the VCR wars, VHS versus Betamax. You know, where Betamax was the better product, but VHS actually had the momentum, and OpenStack had the momentum. Yeah, and for you guys that are born like in the 90s or beyond, it's, you know, big cassette tape, you pushed it in and you got a picture, and yeah, never mind. So we ended up choosing OpenStack at the time. And clearly, today was a good choice in the sense that, of course, you know, Eucalyptus and CloudStack might have not been as evolved as OpenStack has been today. But the difference was that as we took this step, we made a big difference. We made a choice to say, instead of doing what we did back in 2005, 6, 7, just saying, hey, we got free software and we're using it, and not know anything more about it, we said, let's try it the other way around. Let's start engaging into this community and say, what more can we actually get out of it? And as we've done that, of course, we've seen tremendous payback in the sense that there's a lot of values one can talk about. But of course, that once you have people that actually know more about the product, ultimately the easy answer is that you're going to be able to do more with the product because you simply know more about it. But there's a lot of other aspects to it. And I believe that when it comes to the Nordics in general, I think that, you know, you have splendid companies like Ericsson are engaging a lot. But for the enterprise in general, we don't engage that much, which means that I also think that we also miss out on a bunch of innovation that's going on and happening around open source. And as we know, as the world is playing out, the choices are becoming more and more limited, right? We got some hyperscalers, and yeah, we got OpenStack and certainly Kubernetes and some other things, but yeah, it's limited as in where we stand. So for us, that's been a very, very interesting journey, and I think that today we're seeing so much more, and I'm hoping that we can get a chance here to encourage a little bit more, as in what you can do with open source and when you engage. So trying to shoot over here a little bit to you, Chris, and say, so what do you think from a value perspective? What do you see value-wise?
Good question. Values are different if you're a consumer or a producer or a community member. The values that you expect and you want are different in each case. The most valuable, I think, open source concept comes right back to availability. It's there, it's usable, it's available. And that's the driver for most people to begin adoption. That's why you chose OpenStack in the first place. Once you start to use more, you start to engage more. As you start to engage, you start to accommodate what we sort of define as community values. What are the community values? OpenStack has the 4 opens, and I'll let someone from the foundation talk through the 4 opens. But you start to sort of live and breathe those values as you consume, as you talk to the community, and you begin to adopt, whichever values the community sort of drives forwards as their mission and how they want to work as a community. And that's really important, because OpenStack doesn't work if you don't have a community. You need to be accommodating, you need to engage others, you need to be able to address new use cases that you don't care about, and that's all driven through the values that you bring into the communities you work with.
I'll add to that and just say, one of the things that I find is amazing is the shared values, right? Many times you'll find that people that work with open source, they share a lot of values that you share as well. We talk a lot about open, and that is actually something that's very, very deep, and something that you find most people will agree on and also work accordingly, which means many times there's a whole different level of sharing, for example. But so moving forward to that and talking about how this works, I was amazed just a few years ago, saying like, okay, you got 4,000 people that are all contributed to this humongous thing, in this case OpenStack, but it can be anything really, contribute to this humongous thing, spread all over the world. And then every 6 months, bloop, comes this perfect piece of software. How in the world? I mean, I'll be honest, I sometimes have a hard time communicating with the person right across the desk, right? How do you get 3,000-4,000 people communicating from all over the world and actually make this happen? So punting that over to you, Chris. So how does a foundation work, and how does the community work?
With a little bit of structure. Structured anarchy, I guess, is a good way to describe it. People need to know what they're doing. They need to know what the expectations are. That's where values come in handy. But values aren't how you write code, and values aren't how you communicate with people. So you need to have mechanisms that allow people to engage. And the OpenStack Foundation, for instance, is a very good, solid foundation that has more or less the right pieces to make these things work. You have a board, and the board is the group of people that sit there and talk about what are we doing, how should we be doing things, how can we best support our community. And I sit on the board of OpenStack, and I see my role as kind of the guy that's paving the street, right? I'm not building OpenStack. What I'm trying to do is make the street easier for all the people building OpenStack to actually get on with doing what they're doing. And the board provides a very strong support role for the community. Technical committee then, that's kind of the brains trust of the foundation. They're the guys that drive the values into the community. They engage with all the developers. They bring communication mechanisms together to allow resolution of conflict, collaboration on features. The technical committee really is, in my view, probably the most important component of any good open source community. Open source is about the software, right? That's what we want it for, that's what we want to use, and they're the guys that look after it.
So what about the user committee? What do they do?
User committees are great. User committees are a really good indication that a certain project has some level of maturity. User communities are where people that use the software come together and they want to talk and engage with the people building the software around how they want to use it and the types of values they have. You won't see a user community in a new software. You won't see a user community in a software that isn't taking off, that isn't really evolving and emerging. It's a really good sign of maturity, and it's the way you give feedback. It's the way you, as a consumer that isn't writing code, for instance, talk to the technical committee about what it is that that's causing you problems, so that they know how to then head off and address those things.
So can I summarize that? So we got a board, we do the governance up there, so to speak, in general. We got a technical committee, and by the way, we have Mohammed here, deep into his computer over there, who's part of the technical committee for OpenStack, where a lot of the decisions are made, as in where's the roadmap going as far as technical aspects, and then the user committee giving feedback for that, right? Because we're all their users, making sure that we get the use cases and all that feedback that needs to go down to the people that actually do the job, so to speak. Is that a fair assessment?
That's a fair assessment. We have a few technical committee members here, we have a few board members here, and we have a lot of users.
Yeah, make sure that you try to hook up with some of these people. I know, like I said, Mohammed's going to be out here most of the day and answer any questions that you might have about what engagement would mean if you want to join any of these types of committees or just want to join and contribute in one way or the other.
Question for you. Why did you choose OpenStack? And second question, what do you think the result would have been for you if you'd chosen a different project?
Well, I mean, I think that I kind of gave the reasoning around OpenStack, right? Back then in 2012, it was so early and so literally immature that we were probably betting on a horse and kind of were a little lucky, in all honesty. You know, the VCR joke there, it kind of had some relevance, right? But again, I think that the momentum and I think that the size of the community and what are the companies that are actually going behind the community, of course, is tremendously important, right? Because that kind of sets the tone. Now, OpenStack has, of course, gone through some cycles up and down. You know, you go through the hype cycle and then all of a sudden it just works. And once it works, it's not as much fun anymore, right? So I think it came down to the support that we saw. And, you know, in essence, if another project, you know, I think it would have not been as good, but I think it would have been a different journey with a different outcome. But I think that we would have had a chance to contribute there as well.
Yeah, I think that's one of the challenges with open source in general. I mean, if you're going to choose an open source operating system, Linux is a pretty easy choice these days. There are options if you have specific needs in other areas, but that's kind of where you go.
So from a benefit perspective, so if I contribute into a community or anything, what do you think are the benefits that a company gets out of that?
What do you get from contributing?
Yeah, like if I want to engage, if I'm sitting here today, for example, and we're not engaging, we're an enterprise, we don't necessarily know that much about open source, but you know, we want to take the step. What do you think the benefits are once you take the step to see?
It's a journey. Generally, you choose, you start consuming. Right? You say, this is the way we want to go, this seems to fit our needs, and you start to use it, you start to work with the software. What you get from that is a really great piece of software. What you don't get from that is things that you might need specifically.
Yeah.
You move into a phase then where it's like, how do I get the things that I need? How do I get this feature, or how do I scale that in a different way? And that's where you start to collaborate with the community. What you get by starting to push that feature in that direction isn't so much just I get the feature, but you actually start to influence the community's thinking a little bit. You start to have an impact on how they're making decisions, so that if they start to build new features, they sort of accommodate the types of use cases that you have. Mm. And this is where something like OpenStack has traditionally been seen as infrastructure as a service. Now it's more generic infrastructure. It's looking at edge use cases, it's looking at a number of different things, and that's because people come to the community, they bring their use cases, they talk through these things, and then the community sort of adapts and starts to sort of, okay, we need to be able to think about these things as well. So contributing isn't just about getting only the feature you want, it's about getting a future and a stability, and it's about getting all the features that other people bring that you didn't realize you wanted until they were there.
You know, we talk a lot about contributing, right? Contribution in general. And so at City Network, for example, we don't have a ton of developers, right? So when we started looking at OpenStack as a serious option for us to move forward, we said we do want to contribute, but we don't necessarily have the organization to do so. We talk about features and code and so forth. So I just want to mention that there's a ton of ways that one can get involved. It doesn't necessarily mean having the best programmers and putting code in. That's one part of it, of course. So we've engaged in many different ways. It can be from a user committee perspective in the sense of making sure that the right use case is there. I know there's a bunch of banks here. So banks, they might have a particular type of use case that they want to make sure that they communicate in there. This event today takes a lot of time to organize. Somebody's got to do that. There's a lot of that kind of contribution that people can do as well. So it's not just about code. There's a lot of aspects of how you can drive a community forward. And I just want to see if I can click this forward here. So I can't even read this guy's name. Did you want to jump in before that?
Well, go talk about Frank.
Frank. Yeah, Frank. Anybody know Frank? So there's this dude, Frank, who's done quite a bit of research about open source. And the easy answer, reading a lot of pages, but the answer that he comes out saying is that a company that engages in a community, regardless of what open source project it is, will get 100% more out of what they're doing with the software. And one simple aspect of that is, of course, the fact that if you have developers or something like that that are getting into this, they're going to, of course, know the code better. They're going to know all the options better. They're going to get to know some people that actually know other aspects of it, and they can now pull these people to get more information and so forth. So there's a lot of steps that leads into why, from a business perspective, it actually makes a ton of business sense to start engaging. And this is where we have a little bit of a thing. We'll talk a little bit about Nordics here, about how we in the Nordics can do better when it comes to that. We have, for whatever reason, fallen pretty heavily into a proprietary path, even though we're good at open source. Linus, I guess he's from the Nordics, right? Finland, MySQL, some very big projects that stems from the Nordics. I believe somebody said, the innovation in the Nordics, you got to put both Texas and California together to get the same innovation grade, right? So, but coming back to that, so
staying on Frank's point, actually, I was aligned with that. I was going to talk a little bit about employees and people engaged and employees, people. Let's use that word. The people in your company have two different ways of being able to work. You can call a supplier and you can have a help desk number and you can try and manage someone else's software. You can take open source software which may not come with the same PowerPoints and user manuals, and then your employees, the people in your company, can learn that software and they can be engaged with the community. They don't need a phone to call the support desk. You don't need to ask for features in 6 months in advance. You can start to engage with the community and take control of what's happening in your networks. It creates a different dynamic, not just for you as an enterprise, for instance, that may be using the technology, but for everyone in your company. It's not just now we buy this from this guy and it seems to work, but we are part of a movement, an ecosystem. We consume that ecosystem, we give back to the ecosystem, and it just makes a huge difference in the general average employee's life. I mean, and I speak just for myself there, but I've heard the same story from many.
But talking about that then, so, I criticize us in the Nordics a little bit for not engaging enough into open source, right? I personally believe that there's a ton of innovation that we might just lack if we don't. So I would like to push that and continue to push that going forward. But so Ericsson, as a company, of course, I think they're like the flag bearer, I would say, for the Nordics as far as open source goes, right? They're involved in a ton of these. They have a ton of employees working with it. Chris, of course, being a guru. I like to call you Swedish, but he's actually from Australia. You can kind of hear that on that accent, right? But you've been here long enough to be called somebody from the Nordics. So tell me a little bit about, so Ericsson is involved in so many different projects. What's your strategy there? And like, why is Ericsson engaging so heavily? And again, what's Ericsson benefiting from that?
So I think it's good to up-level when we discuss the strategy. What's our strategy? Our strategy is to work with open source, engage with communities, adopt new technologies. If you look around what's happening in the world, new things come out. Blockchain comes out, we'll hear about that today. Kubernetes comes out, we'll hear about that today. How did they come to the world? They came through open source. Technology evolution, technology leadership now is not something that we do in white papers as much as we do through software contribution in open source. So from Ericsson's perspective, this is clearly something that we want to be part of. It's clearly something we want to leverage, and it's clearly something we want to give back to. This is an ecosystem that we are coming to understand better year by year, engaging in further year by year. We have this year, for instance, started the company I work in, Ericsson Software Technology, which has the purpose of trying to work with that and trying to work with all the different business units and product teams in Ericsson to better integrate software, better work with the communities, and not just as a consumer, but as a company that gives back, that leads in open source, and that develops new products and new technologies and exposes them. We have a history. We have a number of things with open source, Bluetooth, Erlang, other things historically, but we haven't had a conscious corporate viewpoint to be exposing broadly across our portfolio in the way that we're starting to address that now. So from an Ericsson perspective, we have very big visions around how we want to work, but we also have very, very think globally, act locally. We have really strong opinions that we should be doing more with the Nordics, that we should help the Nordics become leaders in open source, and that's part of the mission.
Well, I think that was a nice little lead into the next slide here. Let's see if we can click going forward. So talk about that, Chris. So you're now the head of Ericsson Software Technology, and certainly Ericsson's put a lot of force behind open source, and ultimately, of course, something that ends up in Ericsson's products around the world. So does many other telco companies in general. So Nordics, tell us a little bit about that. So we got this kicked off here during the spring, and give us a little bit of feedback on Nordics.
Nordics is a new initiative that we started this year again. So I talk to lots of people and companies around open source, and one of the most common things I hear is, yeah, but you're Ericsson, you can do stuff like that.
Yep.
You have the scope, you have the scale, you have the money, you can get involved in all of this wonderful stuff, and we can't. It's too much for us. We have one guy. I hear this a lot. We have one guy that's looking at Kubernetes, or we have one guy that's looking at virtualization.
I think I said that as well.
Yeah. And I sort of starting to think to myself, there's lots of one guys out there. Like there are lots of one guys, and they're all one guys sitting in the corner of this company, kind of the pariah, if you like, trying to figure out what this stuff is and bring it back to the company. So I met with Johan and had a chat with Johan. It's like, can we do something about this? Can we help those one guys? So we decided, let's form an open source foundation, and let's create a foundation that through larger companies like Ericsson brings all of these technologies into one place, creates an environment where one guy can actually come and have an impact, and one guy can actually come and talk with all the other one guys, and soon you'll find you're not one guy, you're actually 12 guys from different companies all trying to address the same thing and find the same solution to very similar problems. And Nordics is really about that. It's about creating a local ecosystem. We're not going to fork OpenStack and Kubernetes and all that sort of stuff. We're going to bring it to the Nordics. And then what we're going to do is find people in the Nordics that want to work with it and bring them back to the upstream communities, such as OpenStack, and create this movement, this sense of belonging in those places. And that's really what Nordics is about.
All right.
What do you take out of Nordics? Or what do you expect from Nordics?
So, for me, it's two sides, right? It's many times I think for us here, it's like difficult. How do we even get started? I mean, we talk about that at the board level as well sometimes. How do we make it easier to get started? How do I get started contributing to OpenStack? It feels like it's, something that's out there and it's quite difficult. So I think that bringing a local, having people here that actually you can sit down and talk to and work together with will make that easier. So on the one side, you have, of course, the contribution when it comes to code and so forth. On the other side, I think it's a lot about the educational side. Meaning that we as enterprises out there, we need to we all go through this digital transformation, we know that, right? And that in itself is a huge, huge transformation, and we all need new knowledge around that. And I believe that we can come together and solve a lot of those problems together. I mean, just to give you an example here is, we, at City, we believe data lakes is something that enterprise is ready for prime time. We've talked about data warehousing a lot and so forth. We believe that there's a lot of people out there thinking, okay, I can go Cloudera, Hortonworks, and these guys. Now that's one company actually, and but it's usually very, very different when you go that route. But there's a ton of options on the other side. But we believe that a lot of people don't know of it. So the first part that we're engaging in, as far as Nordic goes, is simply to learn more about that. How can we take a bunch of guys from students and from other companies get together, make sure that we learn how we can run this at the best way, and do so open source. And how can we contribute potentially to those projects to make sure that, for example, we become better at utilizing, open source within data lakes, knowing that open source is so broad, so to speak. So we have those four. This is our last slider. We're coming to the end of the presentation. So we have a couple of these. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is really what we set out to achieve with Nordics, and I don't want to ramp on Nordics too much, but really it's about local collaboration, it's about education and learning, it's about being able to contribute and having peers around you that will help you contribute, and then about recognition. We have a local place here where we can recognize local contributions, and that's just it. That's what we're trying to achieve. Yeah. Welcome everyone and anyone to get involved. I think we're out of time.
Yeah, I think that's perfect timing. 17 seconds, perfect. Any questions?
10 seconds.
Before we shoot out. I know it's early, I know it's coffee, and wow.
We have one question.
Just, let me bring out the microphone.
He had 2 cups of coffee.
Hi. My name is Martin. I'm the leader of Norwegian Unix user group, established in 1984. And we are actually doing the same as Nordics. So we should be Nordic and cooperate with each other.
Yes, we should.
And I think that's the challenge for next year.
Good. Challenge accepted.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. And again, some of these events, of course, allows us to bring that together. Otherwise, we wouldn't even know each other, right?
Exactly.
So reach out. We're going to be out there during the day, so reach out. Any other thoughts? Crystal clear? All right, thank you guys. Oh, maybe one lagger there.
Quick one. How many companies are part of the Nordic Foundation today?
So currently, there's 7 companies that are involved, and we're hoping to grow that. We have a board of 5 people.
4 to 5, yeah.
And the whole idea, of course, is to make sure that we can funnel some of that. And a lot of that's going to go back to OpenStack. It's not like we're going to do our own little thing only, so to speak. A lot of that contribution goes back to some of the bigger projects, but trying to do it as a team. So it's small. We just started it, and we're hoping that this is maybe a little bit of a kickoff to make sure that we all start engaging a little bit more in open source as a whole. And Nordics is one way. Certainly, going straight to OpenStack or anything else is very possible as well.
Yep. We're the believers right now that are trying to build it. Hopefully we can bring everyone else along. I think we should get off the stage.
All right.
I really
Thank
do.
you guys so much.
All right. Thanks.